So today I wanted to talk about Mark Clark and kind of what happened at Salerno. I don't think Clark was really that great a general, a fighting general, and I kind of want to explore that by looking at what happened at Salerno. So Clark was born in New York in 1896. He graduates from the military academy at West Point. His maternal grandfather had been Jewish, and that was there were a lot of accusations that maybe that hurt his career, some anti-Semitism. He struck up a friendship with Eisenhower at West Point. And during World War I, he eventually serves as a captain. He had some health issues, but he makes it over to France. He's serving as a captain, commanding a battalion. And then I believe it was during the Meuse-Argonne offensive, he is wounded by artillery. And he hadn't been serving that long. I think it's early May. He's wounded by artillery in 1918, and he's been a few weeks recovering in the hospital. He then became the G4, that's a supply officer to the General Staff of the First Army in Europe, and by all accounts he did an outstanding job, and that was one of Clark's great strengths. He was a tremendous organizer, and he was just a guy that knew how to put things together and knew how things worked, and that's one of the reasons why he has such a meteoric career. In fact, after the war, he is going to have a officer write him a letter saying, I should have recommended you for a Distinguished Service Medal for what you did as a G4 officer, and he won't let it go. And the time constraints for getting the medal had already passed, but he was so ambitious, and he kept trying to write letters to people to get it somehow to earn that medal, and he does not earn it for his service in World War I. But again, he serves in various staff appointments, and then finally in 1938 or so, he became the G3, the operations officer for the 3rd Division, which I believe was in Washington State. And he's going to actually organize the first division-level amphibious invasion maneuver with that, I think in Monterey, California in early 1940. And again, he does a fantastic job. He gets in there, and I believe too, while he was serving in Washington, he actually strikes up at Washington State. He struck up a friendship with George Marshall, and they kind of started to correspond there. But when he leads this amphibious maneuver, he kind of catches the eye of Leslie McNair, and Leslie McNair is soon going to be promoted to the Chief of Staff of the Army General Headquarters, later designated Army Land Forces. And McNair wants him to come to work for him. And while he is serving with McNair, eventually he gets his first star. And he does an outstanding job again in being kind of McNair's right hand in organizing the 1941 Louisiana maneuvers. He does an outstanding job helping to organize that, to write the rules for the umpires to use. And he organizes the briefings after the maneuvers for all the leading generals and their staffs. So again, he just does a fantastic job. Now, when Marshall was actually looking for someone on the War Plans Division, he actually asked Clark who he thought, and he said, give me 10 names. And Clark said something to the effect of, well, I'll give you one name with 9 dittos underneath it. And it was Eisenhower. He had recommended Eisenhower. So Eisenhower goes to work for Marshall, and so this connection between the two men kind of solidifies there. Shortly thereafter, once World War II begins in earnest after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, Clark and Eisenhower go to Europe. They go to Britain to begin to coordinate how the United States buildup in England will take place. Of course, they meet with Churchill and other leading British generals and British figures, and they begin to set that up. When Eisenhower is promoted to the position of leading the torch landings, he actually makes Clark his deputy commander. There was really, as I understand it, there was no real precedent for that role of a deputy commander, but Eisenhower was convinced that there was so many moving parts associated with the torch landings that should anything happen to him, he wanted somebody who could just easily fit in there. And I don't think Clark was especially pleased to do that job. He'd been commanding the Second Corps for a time in England as it was building up, and I think he was looking forward to kind of a combat command, but Eisenhower makes him his deputy. Well, shortly before the landings, Clark is sent on a mission to meet with French representatives in North Africa. It was kind of a clandestine operation. He's taken by submarine and then rows a kind of a folding boat from the submarine to the shore. He meets with French officials, kind of explaining to them the Allied position and what they expected of them once the landings in North Africa began. And it was kind of it didn't really work out the way they wanted it to work out. The French kind of obfuscated and were not really ready to commit at that time to backing the Allies. But there was a scary moment where some police officers came by, and Clark and the other members of his party had to hide in a basement. And then when they were actually going back out to the boat, the seas were tossing and turning, and Clark and the men had to take off their clothes down to their underwear to keep them dry. But then the boat overturned, and they actually had to go back to shore for a time. And it was kind of a fiasco. But nevertheless, when he got back to I think Gibraltar, where Eisenhower's headquarters was, Eisenhower was thrilled to hear what had happened, and he recommends him for finally his Distinguished Service Medal. So after the torch landings had succeeded in November of 42, the next month they're looking at actually forming a corps. They had the kind of the task forces made up of the units under Patton and under Fredendall, and I believe Ryder, and they're looking to form a corps to actually kind of make the push into Tunisia. And Eisenhower wanted Clark to command this. He offered him the command, and Clark actually refused the command. And he clearly was holding out for a field army command, which was a little... it's pretty in character for Clark, considering how... he's very ambitious, and he didn't want to take something that was beneath him, I believe. So I want to say it's just the first part of January, Marshall formally activates the Fifth Army, the United States Fifth Army. Now, the Fifth Army is created as a training army, and so Clark is put in charge of this training army in North Africa. They set up all sorts of schools. They set up mountain warfare schools, bombing schools, artillery schools. They set up all these different schools in order to train the various constituent elements of the Fifth Army. Now, while he's there training, of course, events are playing out in Tunisia. At this time, by that time, Bradley was commanding Second Corps and kind of moving into Tunisia under Eisenhower's command. And Clark was just scared to death he wasn't going to be able to actually take his army into the fighting. And Eisenhower kept assuring him, "Look, we're going to use the army. We're going to use the army. Don't worry, we're going to use it." But Clark, it wasn't really good enough for Clark. And Clark was something of a shit stirrer. To Patton, he kind of denigrated Eisenhower, kind of called him names. Patton mentions this in his diaries. And then, too, he also kind of talks crap about the British to the French and the French to the British. And his hope really was to insert the Fifth Army into any kind of a vacuum that the distrust between the French and the British might create. And it was really beneath him, and it was, you could argue some of the things he was saying was borderline treasonous. But certainly everybody grumbled about the Allies and the American army, but he does it in such a way as to really sow distrust so that he can insert his force in there. Eisenhower actually had to sit him down and talk to him and kind of set him straight and say, you can't be doing this sort of thing. Alan Brooke, the chief of the Imperial General Staff, news of Clark's machinations got back to him. He said something to the effect that Clark was creating trouble. He said he was ambitious and unscrupulous, and he said it was kind of unexpected what Clark was saying, and he really disliked the notion that somehow Clark was trying to discredit the British in the eyes of the French, and it was really quite disturbing to him. And also too, he'd heard that the Marshal had kind of taken Clark to task, and he said that Ike's stock kind of rose in his estimation. So he was causing problems. Now, when the decision is made to actually invade Italy and put the Fifth Army in at Salerno, there's something very important that needs to be considered here. Now, Clark of course, gained his reputation as just this tremendous organizer, and he was. He was a great staff officer. But he's going to be commanding. In choosing Clark to lead the Fifth Army into Salerno, they were essentially choosing a guy to command a field army whose last command had been a battalion, and that had been 25 years earlier. He had no practical experience commanding at the division level or at the corps level, and that is so important in this war. And certainly by this point, there were other candidates available. They could have, moved Patton around. They could have elevated Bradley at this point. There were people that did have some division experience. Certainly, Terry Allen could have taken over for Bradley in Tunisia. There were things they could have done. But they give this guy who's got virtually no modern combat experience, and certainly not combat experience at the division and corps level, a command of a field army, which is fine if you're commanding a training army, but now he's going to take this army into battle. And people kind of said, well, I think it was Eisenhower said something to the effect of, well, he's got experience with amphibious operations because he led those maneuvers at Monterey, California. So Operation Avalanche, which is the invasion of Salerno, was set for September 9th, 1943, and this was the United States Fifth Army. The Fifth Army at this time consisted of the United States Sixth Corps and the British 10th Corps, and there were two divisions in reserve. The plan, of course, is to land near Salerno, and the hope was relatively easily they could make their way north toward Rome. Now, a few days prior to the landings at Salerno, Bernard Montgomery and the British Eighth Army had actually crossed the Straits of Messina from Sicily into Italy, and that force was apparently working its way north. The theory was if they moved quickly enough that he could support Clark's landing at Salerno, but the reality was Montgomery was very cautious, as he was prone to be, and he's moving quite slowly. And so by the time of the Salerno landings, it was pretty obvious they couldn't count on the support of the Eighth Army, and they went ahead with it as it was, fully understanding that Montgomery was not going to have a major effect on this operation. Right at the field there was the Sele River, S-E-L-E. And in the early morning of the hours, the British 10th Corps lands north of the Sele River, and the 6th Corps landed south of the river. Now, you had some elements of the 16th Panzer Division, which was opposing these initial landings. The original, the Fifth Army Historical Summary from the National Archives read, quote, "The landings south of Salerno took place in the face of machine gun, artillery, tank, and shore battery fire. The Germans had mined the beaches extensively. Our shipping suffered damage from mines which had been planted in the Gulf of Salerno." So there was some initial significant enemy resistance, but the Germans began to pull back under the weight of the Allied assault. They covered their retreat with some heavy artillery fire. Now, one thing that was interesting, because Clark and his team devised this attack. Now, Clark's chief of staff was a fellow by the name of Al Gruner, and about a week or so before the landings, George Patton had visited Gruner, and he met with Gruner for about 45 minutes or so, and Patton was kind of taken aback because he said Gruner was interested in administration. He wasn't interested in kind of the operational and tactical questions that were fundamentally important to this operation. And Gruner did say to Patton, "Do you want to look over the plans for the invasion?" Patton did, but he said, "Look, this boundary you've got between the 6th Corps and the 10th Corps is the Sele River, which means these two corps are not going to be able to support each other. If they're attacked, they can't effectively support each other." And Patton said, "You are not devoting, you're kind of landing and then wanting to move outward, but you're not devoting nearly enough forces to actually protecting the river valley itself." And Patton wrote in his diary, quote, "I told him just as sure as God lives, the Germans will attack down that river." Gruner's position was that he had more than enough artillery prepared to bombard anything that came down the river valley. Patton tells him, look, something along the lines of, no plan survives contact, and Gruner just didn't register with him, right? So 3 days after the landing, 3 days after they're there, Patton is proven correct. The Germans launched this just massive counterattack down the Sele River Valley, And what they're trying to do, of course, is they want to drive a wedge between the two corps, which are already separated by the river. Albert Kesselring, the German commander there, he actually later wrote in his memoirs, quote, "The fighting on the beaches of Salerno, despite the Allies' overwhelming air superiority, their tremendous naval gunfire, and our numerical weakness, went better than I dared hoped." So the 76th Panzer Corps hit the American units south of the Sella hard. And German commanders, they report back to Kesselring that they can throw the enemy back into the sea, that they are going to succeed here. Kesselring and the 10th Army commander, Heinrich von Wettinghoff, they were skeptical. They didn't quite believe they could do it. The Allies later called September 13th the Black Monday of the operation. The 5th Army was just being hit hard, particularly the American Corps south of the river. Eisenhower actually wrote a letter to General Albert Wedemeyer, and he wrote, quote, "Clark is unable to move and cannot clear away the German artillery covering the airfield in Salerno Bay." Now, by this he means the airstrip that was at Monte Corvino. The Germans were coming whole hog. Eisenhower wrote in his memoirs later, he said, "The German attack struck in all its fury, and fierce fighting ensued for a considerable period." And he noted that the Germans came within about 2 or 3 miles of the beach itself. Harry Butcher, Eisenhower's naval aide, notes that Clark was starting to get skittish. He was getting scared. Essentially, the American units are taking a heavy, heavy beating, and it's looking like they might get pushed back to the sea. Eisenhower sent Clark a letter later in the day. He said, quote, "We know you are having a sticky time, but you may be sure that everybody is working at full speed to provide you the reinforcements you need." He said the Air Force was on board. They're ready to provide you the full support. I believe he reached out to James Gavin and asked for help there as well. It was on that 13th September attack, the Germans were hitting the 6th Corps near the town of Parsano. Now, the Corps at the time was commanded by Ernest J. Dawley, and the attack hit the 36th Division very hard, and you had significant casualties before the division was kind of pulled back and able to regroup. Clark telephoned Dawley. He said, "Well, what are you going to do? What are you currently working on?" Dawley's reply was, quote, "Nothing, I have no reserves, all I've got is a prayer." So not only did 6th Corps not have any reserves, but because Clark landed the 5th Army on both sides of the Selle, Clark doesn't really have any reserves to meet the Germans either by this point. He kind of says in his memoirs later, "Well, I had to consider the possibility that we'd be driven into the sea." So what he does is Clark contacts the invasion admiral, Henry Hewitt, and he commanded the armada tasked with protecting the 5th Army from the sea. And he does not inform his corps commanders or his division commanders, but he instructs Hewitt. He says, "I want you to prepare a plan to evacuate the 6th Corps south of the Selle and transport it north of the Selle, where then the two corps can support each other." Now, this was a crazy plan. There was no preparations for this at all prior to the landing. There were no contingency operations that called for this sort of thing. And embarking an entire corps in front of a hostile enemy is an incredibly dangerous maneuver. Now, Clark later denied that he seriously considered evacuating the corps. He later wrote in his memoirs, quote, "A commander always is supposed to have an alternate plan, and I felt that if it came to a point where we had to abandon part of the beachhead, we should be able to evacuate some troops by sea to the British sector and continue the fight from there." But then he kind of says, in creating the order and getting ready to destroy supplies, he said, quote, "Finally, I said to hell with the theory. Furthermore, I decided the only way they're going to get us off this beach is to push us step by step into the water." And he even wrote his mother a letter saying that evacuation was never in our thoughts. However, during the crisis, he actually talks to his commanders. He meets with Dawley and some of the division commanders. And when he informs them of the possibility of evacuation, they grumble. Dawley told him, he said, "I'm going to stay where I am. I'm going to keep fighting. Even if you give an evacuation order, I'm going to stay here." And behind his back, his division commanders really start kind of questioning his resolve, which is poison in any kind of a military structure. You've got to have faith in your superiors. On the 14th of September, Harold Alexander, who was the 15th Army Group commander, who was nominally Clark's direct superior, he was on board the USS Biscayne, and Alexander heard about preparations for an evacuation. He was not happy about it, and Hewitt was definitely not happy about it. Supposedly, Alexander said to Hewitt, "Oh no, we can't have anything like that. There will be no evacuation." So Alexander then decided to visit the beach. He meets Clark, and he discusses the situation with him. Clark seemed to suggest that indeed the Germans could push the Sixth Corps into the sea. The British 10th Corps commander, Richard McCreary, he opposed the idea of evacuation, and so did Dawley. Pretty much everybody is against the idea of evacuation by this point, except Clark himself. And McCreary even comments on the danger that re-embarking the Sixth Corps would present. Alexander told him firmly, he makes a decision. He says, "We'll get you more reinforcements soon, but you are not going to evacuate this beach." On September 16th, Eisenhower wrote to Marshall. He mentioned that Alexander claimed to be very favorably impressed with Clark and his calmness and serenity under those circumstances. But further, Eisenhower noted that Clark's evacuation order and that plan, quote, caused consternation because it seemed to indicate that the commanders on the spot were discouraged and preparing to withdraw the whole force. Now, Eisenhower was no doubt aware of Alexander's intervention against the evacuation order, and if he had any serious doubts about Clark's ability at that time, he didn't share it. And again, who knows, maybe he was covering for an old friend. As I say, he and Clark had known each other since West Point. It was Clark that had elevated him to the War Plans Division under Marshall, and so who knows? Who knows exactly what was happening? And it is possible that Eisenhower believed that kind of Clark's temporary loss of nerve did not diminish the fact that he had ultimately, successfully, landed an American army on the continent of Europe. Clark failed here in two key aspects. First of all, he created the conditions, he created a plan for the landing of the Salerno that allowed for there to be that 10-mile gap across the Sella River down the valley that divided his forces on either side so they could not support each other. The Sella is about 200 feet wide at its mouth. I don't know how much wider it was further down, but it was certainly too far apart that they could not easily reinforce each other. And predictably, the Germans exploited this disposition of his units. Now, secondly, Clark's skittishness, his anxiety for an untested battlefield commander, it leads him to prepare this plan for evacuation, this crazy plan for evacuation, to move the Sixth Corps, to re-embark them and put them on north of the Selle. After Clark informs his subordinate commanders of the plans, it sank morale, and the generals began to lose faith in Clark's leadership. And it was a dangerous and foolish decision to rock those officers' confidence in such a manner. And Clark's inexperience in high command was incredibly evident with what happened here. Now, I should point out, whatever anxiety over the ultimate fate of Fifth Army he showed, however skittish he was about pulling that corps out and re-embarking it north of the river, one thing that you do need to know is that Clark did show personal courage on the beaches of Salerno, and he moved among the troops. He was a frontline commander. He encouraged them. He gave directions. At least at one point, he took a defensive position in action. He actually led some units holding their position there. And in fact, so great was his personal courage that a few months later, Gruner writes to Eisenhower and says he should get a Distinguished Service Cross for what he did there. In fact, in that letter, Gruner wrote, quote, General Clark constantly has maintained close personal contact with the frontline units. Many of his almost daily visits to the troops have been made under fire and always without regard to his own personal safety. So you can credit Clark with real personal courage on the battlefield. Now, Clark goes on to continue to fight in Italy. I think he makes some pretty poor decisions later in that campaign as well. The Rapido River, during his moving to take Rome instead of following his orders to trap the 10th Army, the German 10th Army. I think he makes a lot of bad decisions. Could a more experienced commander who understood how to command and hold with a division and with a corps, if he had that experience, would he have seriously lost his nerve here at Salerno and had to be kind of reinforced, have his fortitude reinforced by an order from Alexander? Who knows? In any case, I'm not a particularly big fan of Mark Clark. I think he was somebody who tended to put his ambition above his duty. And I think what we see here at Salerno is some evidence of that. he so desperately wanted to fight, but he just did not have the experience to do so. Anyway, those are my thoughts about Mark Clark and what happened at Salerno in 1943. So I'd love to hear any comments you may have, any ideas or insight. I think would be appreciated. And I'd ask you to please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Thank you so much for joining us, and have a fantastic day.